We're all set, George.
Good morning.
Good
My
morning.
name is George Maxwell, and you have joined the old-fashioned Sunday School. It's the 14th day of June, 2020, and we are a class of the Cathedral of St. Philip in Atlanta, Georgia. We are this morning going to continue our discussion of the topic, where do we go from here? I borrowed this title from a book of Martin Luther King's writings, but it seems appropriate to us now as we grapple with race relations and police force and use of force and other racially charged aspects of our society. I had prepared for you a all right, now I can't get this thing to go here. I had prepared for you a kind of an analysis of how we got to where we are and what we might do going forward. And then two things changed my mind. One was watching the documentary, I'm Not Your Negro, which Bill recommended to us. This is the really powerful documentary about James Baldwin. And the second was watching the body camera video and other tapes of last night's shooting here in Atlanta. I trust that you have seen one or both of those. What I was struck by in the documentary, for example, was how visceral it was, how much I felt it in my body, how ready I was to join with Baldwin's philosophical and literary analysis of things. He's such a brilliant, kind of self-taught genius. And yet, I just felt it so deeply, the scenes of Birmingham or the weariness in Baldwin's voice as he addressed the students at the Oxford debates, or the patience he showed with Paul Weiss, the noted scholar in the Dick Cavett interview, when Weiss asked him why he had to make everything about race all the time. But all of these things just resonated in my body. The same thing happened last night as we watched the video of the shooting in Atlanta, and more videos began to pop up. So one of the things we noticed in looking at their Twitter feed were videos of police encounters with white individuals and how differently that seemed from what was happening here in Atlanta when a Black individual was the subject of all of that. But more than the analysis of who did what when, I just felt it in my body. I felt the tragedy of what was happening, and there almost seemed to be a certain inevitability about it all. So I'm not going to talk much about the philosophical meanderings. I do want to root us back in what we've been talking about all year, because it seems so relevant and helpful. One of the pieces of scripture that we have taken as our guide over the course of the year is to put on the mind of Christ, to take on the mind of Christ. And we've talked about what that meant, but I want to remind you that I've said that I think we often read that piece of scripture to mean that we should look at the good qualities of Jesus, his compassion or his impatience, and we should imitate them. We should take on those qualities and imitate them. But I argue that's a lot like putting on the outer garments of Jesus and not taking on the mind of Christ. Taking on the mind of Christ means getting inside of ourselves, our bodies, and identifying where those feelings, where those characteristics, where those traits of Jesus actually came from. We won't be able to put on the mind of Christ until we have found Christ in us. And it will be where we find the sources of our compassion and our love and our care. So I hope you see that distinction between just outer behavior and our inner life. They are inextricably intertwined, but we won't be putting on the mind of Christ until we get into our body and identify where those characteristics came from. And we as Christians tend to name that place the Christ that is within us. So in that vein, I want to start with this opening prayer. And it's on your screen now, so I'll ask you to say it with me. Make my hands your hands, my feet your feet, my heart your heart. Let me see with your eyes, listen with your ears, speak with your lips, love with your heart, understand with your mind, and serve with your will. I commend to you my whole being. Make me your other self. And I hope now you can see where the mind of Christ is what's being described in this prayer. How the taking on of the mind of Christ is reaching inside our bodies and being able to call upon that, what we find there, to activate our behaviors so that we integrate those two things, our inner and our outer lives. I want also to look at this quote from Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me. Ta-Nehisi Coates does, I think, a fabulous job of identifying what it means to be in your body when we start to talk about racism. And listen to what he says. Can't actually see it on my screen, but if you read what you see there, I think you will see that when Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about racism, he's talking about bodies. When he talks about dislodging brains and blocking airways and extracting organs and cracking bones, he's trying, I think, to show us how racism in this country has imposed itself on and distorted Black bodies. And he would later argue white bodies as well. But it's a warning, I think, not to intellectualize what we're talking about, but to realize that when we talk about racism, we are talking about something that is in our bodies, both Black and white, and has its effect on our bodies. So this is really the theme I want to go with today, that we're really talking about something that's in our bodies, and to intellectualize it is always to keep our distance from it. To do that, I'm going to borrow the thought of this writer who has written a book called My Grandmother's Hands. His name is Resmaa Menakem, and he lives in Minneapolis, St. Paul. He's got a fascinating story, I think. He was a therapist in Minneapolis when his brother, who was serving in Afghanistan, he's got 4 family members who were police officers. His brother serving in Afghanistan asked him, ironically, if he knew anybody who knew anything about trauma, because they needed help over in Afghanistan dealing with trauma. Resmaa says he listened with incredulity as his brother asked this question and finally said, "Don't you know I'm a therapist? Like, this is what I do." And he wound up going over to Afghanistan. The Army had plenty of specialists who knew how to deal with trauma, but the military contractors did not. And so Resmaa went over to Afghanistan and really learned something new about trauma as he went from base to base to base, and as they say there, processed the trauma that had been incurred in combat. And he's written several books, but the book I want to focus on is My Grandmother's Hands. And it talks about how the trauma of racism gets into our bodies. So one thing he does is tell a story. The title of the book, My Grandmother's Hands, comes from his memory in childhood. He said they used to sit around the living room watching TV, and his grandmother would kind of throw her legs over the laps of the grandchildren and take her hand and put it on her hip as she watched often the Milwaukee Bucks because they were her favorite team. But she had bad arthritis in her hands, and so she would ask them to rub her hands, which they would do. This is just something they all remember doing throughout their childhood, rubbing their grandmother's hands. And at one point, Rasmus said he just looked up at his grandmother and in a half-joking tone said, "Grandma, why are your hands so fat?" He was noticing how her hands seemed swollen and hard and bearing thick calluses, while his hands were thin and somewhat bony, he describes them. And she took a look at him and she said, "Boy, have you ever seen a cotton plant?" He had never seen a cotton plant, of course, so she proceeded to explain to him that when she was 4 years old, she started walking the fields. And she had to reach into the cotton plant to pull the cotton out. And when she did, the bowl, the little burr in the cotton plant would scrape her hands. And it wasn't long before her hands were bleeding. And this happened every single day. And what happened over time, of course, is that her hands built up thick calluses. So by the time she was several years into this, she could reach into a cotton plant, pull out the cotton, without her hands bleeding. But the consequence of spending a large part of her life doing that were these thick, fat, rheumatoid arthritis-ridden hands. And her feet were the same way. So what Rasmus said is that he didn't really understand what she was saying. He couldn't understand why she was trying to pull a burr out of a cotton plant, but what he did understand was the tone of her voice. What he did understand that this was coming from somewhere deep inside of her and he needed to pay attention. And that, he says, stimulated a lifelong interest and curiosity in what's in our bodies, the knowledge of our bodies and the pain of our bodies and how we carry that. After he wrote his book, his mother read it without telling him, and she called him and thanked him for how he had portrayed his grandmother. But she said, "I'm surprised that you didn't talk about her feet." And Rasmus hadn't even noticed her feet. And then her mother said, her feet were as thick as her hands, as if they had their own leather soles, because she'd had to walk barefoot through those fields for all of those years. And so what emerged was Rasmus' understanding that the pain and other emotions that we experience in our lives, we carry in our bodies. The calluses on his grandmother's hands and feet wound up just being symbols for him of the trauma that she carried in her body. So he says, he defines white supremacy then as white body supremacy. Rasmus says that using terms like white supremacy intellectualizes things. And in doing so, it allows us to be distant from them. But he wants to characterize it as something in our bodies. So he talks about white body supremacy. It is something he believes white people carry and Black people carry. And he also believes that when Black people carry it, they have their own kind of version of it. And when police officers carry it, they often have a white version and a Black version, sometimes at the same time. So what's happening in our society, and has for at least 400 years, is these bodies and their trauma. Rasmus in his book goes back in terms of white body supremacy and analyzes the trauma of the Middle Ages and how that has been passed on from generation to generation until it results in the United States of America. Now, what's interesting about all this, of course, is that a lot of modern science is proving all this to be true. that we do actually transmit trauma from generation to generation. We do it biologically. If a pregnant mother is under extreme stress, her cortisol levels, that a chemical that is generated in our bodies and is activated by our limbic system, that lizard brain, that higher level of cortisol is picked up by the fetus in her body and learns something from that. We also know, of course, that trauma, when it gets into a person's life, becomes a collective experience, and that in turn forms culture. We do things culturally because of trauma that we have experienced. But although the culture is passed on from generation to generation, the context of the trauma often is not. So you get decontextualized trauma. We know that we were afraid of something, but we don't really know why. We don't have the context, but we have kept the fear. I'll give you for me, this resonated because I was in an automobile accident several years ago. I was riding down the interstate and suddenly an 18-wheeler collided with the car that I was in. I didn't see it coming. All I knew is that suddenly there was a smash of metal and broken glass. My mother was on the passenger side of the car, right where the truck had hit us. And of course, we were in the, well, not of course, but we were in the middle lane. We managed to find a gap in traffic, control the car, and get to the median. But I was traumatized by the event. And what I've noticed since is that whenever I'm turning or changing lanes or in a position where I don't know what's happening on that right-hand side, I will feel it in my body. There will be this fear of what is unknown. I will go double check my blind spot. I will not make the turn I was going to turn, but there is this kind of residual trauma. So for me, that experience helps me understand what Resmaa is saying when he talks about white body supremacy. And of course, where he goes with this is we can't heal by thinking. Thinking is good, talk therapy is good, all that is right, but our thinking brains will not heal this trauma. We will instead have to live into it. We will have to know where it is in our bodies. So I would like for you to take a moment right now and just get comfortable, but get into a comfortable posture and pay attention to your body for just a minute. What sensations are you feeling? Is what you're hearing causing you to react in a certain way? It doesn't matter what the reaction is. I only want you to be able to sense it. We're all carrying trauma, Resmaa says, and the key to healing the trauma that racism has caused in this country is to learn how to live into that trauma. He says this about what we're carrying in our bodies. If you have a white body, as he describes it, there are times when you will reflexively constrict, tighten up in order to protect yourself from the truths that you encounter. That constriction might express itself by thoughts. I'm not like that. I'm a good person. Or white body supremacy has nothing to do with me. Or this isn't about me because I don't belong to a racist organization. He says, don't judge that thought. Don't worry about that thought. Don't hold on to that thought. Just notice it. Be in touch with yourself enough to notice that thought. Don't support it. Don't debate it. Don't act on it. Just observe it as it arises. And then let go of it. Now, I hope for some of you, there's a vague recollection there of the welcome prayer, because this is exactly what we've been talking about in the welcome prayer all year, right? Notice, engage, and let go, or notice and welcome and release. The same three elements that have been in that contemplative practice are in what Resmaa is saying. Now he goes on to say, if you have a black body or other dark body, there'll be times when your body will experience a certain shock of recognition or understanding. Things you hadn't fully grasped become suddenly clear. It might be a rush of energy, of joy, of anger, of outrage, or a felt sense of clarity or rightness. Just experience these sensations fully. Don't hang on to them. Let them move into and through your body like a wave, and then let them go. Finally, he says, if you're a public safety professional, you may experience both sets of these sensations, but your reaction should be the same. Let it flow into your body and mind. Don't do anything about it, and let it go, like a steadily shrinking image in your rearview mirror. I want you to have this resonance that what is really happening to us is happening in our bodies, our individual bodies and our collective bodies. And while it's good to think about it, to understand it, we're not going to be able to heal from it if we don't learn how to heal our bodies. Now, Resmaa says our deepest emotions involve a single bodily structure. There's this nerve, and this is what I was talking about coming out of the limbic system. And it is a soul nerve, he calls it. It's also called a vagus nerve. But it is connected with those parts of our nervous systems that we commonly think of as telling us to either run away or stay put, the fight or flight that we talk about so frequently. What's curious about this particular nerve is that it gets the information first. Whatever is happening to us has to go through this nerve. It's actually a nervous system. It has to go through this nervous system before it can actually reach our cognitive, or the neocortex, the cognitive functioning part of the brain. So if that information or situation is trapped in our limbic system and what we're doing is living out the fight or flight response, we don't have time to think about it. Our bodies are already acting. What we do in our contemplative practice and in this very similar practice that Resmaa is recommending is create space in ourselves for that information to get through. We are calming in advance by our practice, which is a continued habituation of our body to a situation. Right? We talk about spiritual practices as creating space in us, an emptiness that allows our consciousness to expand, an emptiness that lets God manifest. You can see, I hope, how that contemplative language fits so squarely into how our nervous system operates. And that soul nerve has to be addressed as we incur more and more trauma, as we inherit more and more trauma, as we absorb the culture's transmission of more and more trauma, then we will more quickly react to it, unless we are doing things to learn how not to. Do you just feel that? This trauma that is literally in our blood and in the air that we breathe is slowly causing us to constrict. It is causing us to be more reactive and less responsive. But it is our contemplative practice or these healing practices that create space, we would say, for God, in order that we can respond to the situation and not react to the situation. In looking at pictures of the Birmingham riots, in that documentary, which looked so much like Minneapolis, I could hardly watch it. It looked like the very same thing, though it was years and years ago. Or watching the video of last night's killing, it's like there's no thinking going on there, right? It's calm, it looks routine, and then in a second, chaos bursts forth, and the next thing you know, there's a cop shooting a black guy. It was reactive and didn't involve response. It can't be addressed by just talking about it or coming up with new procedures, though we clearly should. It's a complicated thing, but somehow we've got to deal with the trauma that we're carrying in our bodies, because the only thing to me that explains those images from last night is the trauma that's carried in our bodies. Now, I don't know what was going through Rayshard Brooks's mind. I don't know why it was that when the cop moved behind him and attempted to handcuff him, he burst forth and tried to run away. And I don't know what was going through that police officer's mind, Garrett Rolfe, when he actually shot Brooks. I don't know what was going through their minds, but what explains it to me is the the trauma that each was holding in their body, a kind of limbic system response to the situation. And what to me is so sad is that it didn't have to be that way, right? It just didn't have to be that way. And I don't care if the force was justified by policy. And I don't care if the training allowed him to do that. And I don't care if one of us would not have tried to run away. I don't think those are the right questions. I think we can agree that it shouldn't have happened, that it didn't have to happen. And how do we stop that from happening again? I don't think we can if we don't address the trauma that's in our bodies. Here again, Resma says, in the aftermath of a highly stressful event, our lizard brain may embed a reflexive trauma response, a wordless story of danger in our body. This trauma can cause us to react to present events in ways that seem out of proportion or wildly inappropriate to what's actually going on. To me, that just seems to explain so much of what was happening in that video. This is what I've told you before, that trauma is passed from generation to generation. And then Resma says, most African Americans know trauma intimately, but different kinds of racial trauma also live and breathe in the body of most white Americans, as well as most law enforcement professionals, which is why when he says white body supremacy, what he is saying is we are all the subject of that. And we are all carrying that around in different ways because of where we sit in that hierarchy. But it's there. But to deal with it, we have to metabolize it. We're going to have to live into it. And this is an interesting point, I think, because what Resma said is when he does his groups, his healing groups and his therapy groups, the last thing he does is put white people and black people together and ask them to go into their most intimate stories and confront the trauma that they have. What he says is all that does is re-traumatize everybody. And when we are re-traumatized, we are back into our limbic systems and we don't learn anything at all. Which is why so much of the diversity training or prejudice reduction training that we do is ultimately unhelpful. Right? It's ultimately unhelpful. But it is also why he thinks that where we have to go is, and this is kind of similar to behavioral therapy, I think, but where you have to go is to the point of being uncomfortable. Don't go diving into your deepest trauma, you'll simply re-traumatize yourself. But go to the point where you're uncomfortable and then don't run away from it. So for white people, he says, find a place that makes you uncomfortable. Maybe a place that's full of Black people, or at least full of a different kind of culture than you're used to. Be enough in your body to know when you feel the sensations of discomfort, and don't leave. Just stay there. You don't have to talk to anybody. You don't have to befriend anybody. You don't have to tell anybody your story. You just have to stay with the tension between fight or flight for a moment. And when you can't take it anymore, leave. And then do it again at another time. It's a practice. Maintaining the tension between fight or flight is the way that we open ourselves. In the contemplative tradition, we believe that's the way we take on the mind of Christ and open ourselves to the presence of God that works inside of us. It's fascinating to me to see Resma making the same argument without calling on God. He grew up in the Baptist tradition. His take on God is not what ours is, and his own trauma from being in an evangelical church that seemed to be all about the preacher getting new cars was more than he could tolerate. And yet he comes up with the same solutions out of his own experience in Afghanistan and the same need for practice. It ain't in our heads. It's not about a new way of talking about things. It's about maintaining the tension between fight and flight so that we're not so traumatized the next time that happens. Trauma is not destiny, he says. It's the body's response to anything unfamiliar, but it can be healed. Trauma is not destiny. Now, also in this discomfort, he describes two kinds of pain, a clean pain and a dirty pain. The clean pain, he said, is the pain that mends. It can build your capacity for growth, right? Again, I want you to see the resonance with contemplative practices. We describe them as building our capacity to experience the presence of God. Similarly, clean pain in Resma's vocabulary is the building of practices that allow us to grow. But then there's dirty pain, and that's the pain of avoidance, the pain of sweeping things under the rug, the pain of just going along. It's still pain. It's still lurking there. Now, one of the things that Resma does is change his vocabulary. So he doesn't talk about white supremacy, but white body supremacy. And he doesn't, although sometimes he talks about Black bodies, often he talks about, or he doesn't talk about bodies of color. He talks about bodies of culture, which I find really interesting. He says bodies of culture mean bodies whose identity have been formed by culture. That being Black does not make you that different. It doesn't make you different in this sense, except to the extent culture tells you that it does. And he goes back and he looks at the evolution of the concept of whiteness and when that actually started to work its way into law and how it came to be seen as a distinguishing mark. Clean pain and dirty pain. Okay. There's more, but this is as much kind of analytical work as I want to do. I wanted simply to show you how being in your body and healing that trauma resonates with contemplative practices, and give you this reference for somebody that I think has got a different take on how to deal with race relations in ways that are helpful, in ways that involve us all, and don't let us get away from what is the core of the issue, and that is our bodies. Okay. So I'm going to pause here before we proceed and see if there are any questions. Dan, would you repeat the all too familiar words now of how we're going to manage questions? Before
Get
Dan,
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
So we can you can simply unmute yourself and ask away.
All right, hearing no questions, I want to do another exercise and then give you a chance to ask questions that might come to you after that exercise. So again, try to assume a comfortable posture. I talked about the vagal nerve, which comes out of your neck and goes into your body, but there's another set of nerves in your hips, which also work to connect your upper body and your lower body. So open your eyes and look straight ahead. Make note of what you're feeling in your body, what sensations you can identify, what thoughts you have. Now turning to the left, using both your hips and your neck. Turn and look to your left. And what do you see there? Now come back to center and turn using your hips and your neck to the right. Make sure you can feel a twist in both. And come back to center. And notice how you feel. What is coming up for you? What has landed, as Resma says. And I wonder if you feel different than you did when we started the exercise. And if so, how? What I noticed in doing that exercise the first time I did it, and it surprised me, was simply a feeling of comfort and settledness. What the sensation I was feeling, that to the extent I could identify them immediately, by the time I was through, I simply felt more aware, less anxious, and more comfortable. All because I engaged those two nervous systems physically, turning to the left and then turning to the right. But I'm curious if anybody had a similar experience.
I had an experience, George. I was feeling relaxed, and when I turned to the left, I'm in a place where I see through a crack, through a doorway to another room, and there's a photograph of my extended family, my 2 children and 2 of my sister's children and my mother. And it's a picture of one of my child's birthdays on the first birthday celebrated in South Carolina without my nephew who died of a drug and alcohol overdose as a sophomore at Clemson, who is my son's age. So my body, when I turned and saw that photograph, immediately shifted, and it reminds me of the trauma that our family narrative carries with that death. There's been a lot of healing and blessing that's come out of that, but it's so interesting to me to have this feeling of peace, turn left, see that photograph, and the 2 places that you're talking about immediately had a sensation in there. So thank you for this exercise.
Thank you, Barbara.
I had one. Can y'all hear me?
Yes, Sherry.
So mine was, I turned left and my window is open to my backyard and this beautiful lawn, and I can see the sun shining in this blue sky and all the trees, and just how lovely that is, and how I can't wait to get outside and experience that. And I turn right and I see this terribly messy bedroom that I need to deal with, and just all, the laundry and whatever, and it make that, I'm going to turn back center. And I thought, let's try to look at both sides, see the beautiful, and then see the messy, and come back to the center and try to look, with this awareness that what came from this exercise. It's like, it opens my mind to trying to see both sides and what we can do. And not just, and kind of in all situations. So I guess it's just an analogy of the overall view. So that was my experience.
Thank you, Sherry.
So I've been feeling so much tension in my body these last few weeks, and especially these last couple days. And so for me, even though this is the kind of practice I try to do frequently, even just that moment of kind of stopping and shifting, I was able to let go of some of that tension. But like others, I also took note of what I saw. So I'm in the kitchen, and when I turned left, I saw this piece of African folk art that my aunt gave me that I love. And I wondered all kinds of things about cultural appropriation and how I should feel about it. And, as we get more and more into this conversation, what are the issues I haven't even identified in it? And then when I turned to the right, I saw a beautiful painting of the marshes near Savannah. And that made me think about the way that I am able to escape this conversation when it gets to be too much for me, and that other people don't have that luxury. So it was an interesting exercise, both physically and kind of movement for me.
I really didn't see anything. I'm looking out the window when I'm looking forward, and it's just pretty outside greenery. But when I started the exercise, I definitely knew I had tension. But then when I turned to look, there really wasn't anything to see, a little bit of wallpaper in both directions. But when I came back to the center, all of a sudden my body just had this calmness in it. So I believe that the actual physical turning in that nervous system had a physical effect on my mental state, as opposed to anything that I saw, so I'm just trying to speak to the turning in the physical body. And anyway.
So I had the most sort of trivial of experiences as I turned left, which was just that I noticed I have some lower back pain these days. But what it did make me think about is that, as a white man, I've lived my life mostly like with a body that I'm in control of. People don't try to intrude on it. I, socially with the law, and it's been a relatively healthy and a body that I can take control of situations with if I need. And I'm getting a little bit older and starting to feel that less. And it just, this whole discussion of body trauma and vagal reaction has made me think about the deep-seated fear and pain that I think I've dealt with a lot of this cognitively and not thought about like that experience. When you talk about, you know, we don't know why he reacted the way he did when the police tried to cuff him, or yeah, I don't know that because no one's ever tried to control me, and I've never feared that the result of that would be something untoward for me. So it probably wasn't the point of the exercise, but it was what struck me.
Thank you, Cody. I think, you know, the beautiful thing about practices is that there's not a right answer, right? You engage that vagal nerve out of your neck and the psoas nerves down in your hips because that tends to release the trauma that is in your body. Resma says that one of the exercises he often does with bodies of culture is when he has them sit down, he has them orient themselves in the room. That is to say, look around, see where you are in the room physically, turn around, look at what's behind you. And what he often experiences is that turning around and noticing what's behind them and that there is no threat there is calming. They didn't even know that they thought there was a threat there. But his belief is that through time, through the cultural and biological transmission of trauma, everything that's happened to Black people from behind, from being whipped to being chased to being run down, is felt. And there is this innate anxiety and trauma in many bodies of culture about the threat that may be behind. And they don't even know it's there. Not everybody, mind you. Resma is clear that just because he's created a category of white bodies or bodies of culture does not mean everybody who bears those physical characteristics fits into that category. We've all had different experiences. But I just want to underscore Cody's point that there are people who feel threats in their body and a chronic anxiety and tension and stress that they've literally inherited, and it is reinforced in culture that we don't feel. You guys know that I served as the director of Emmaus House down in Peoplestown for a while, and I became aware then that for lack of a better term, the absence of beauty and the presence of noise and the constant vigilance I had to maintain to figure out what was going on because I did not understand the behavioral norms of that community. I did not know whether the person walking down the street was a danger to me or not. And the constant vigilance that I had to maintain, and I'm far from powerless in this situation, was exhausting. To get away from the broken concrete, to have the noise calm down, and not to have to be so vigilant. It was exhausting just to be that way. And yet that's the kind of trauma and the kind of environment that builds trauma that I think Resma is talking about.
So George, I'm not sure if you can see what's popping up in the chat.
I can't see anything at all, actually, so thank you.
Okay, well, I'll just read them then. Maria Sophia says that sometimes my mind and body seem to wander away from each other, and turning right and left seem to braid everything back together. And then Bill Gray has a question. Do you think that a key difference on confronting racial tension versus centering prayer is that the fight or flight reaction is towards a tangible external thing, whereas with centering prayer, it's more intangible because it's focused within us? It may be easier to push past the internal conflict because it is anonymous and private. So Bill, I think, is on the call. So if you would like to say more about that, Bill, please do. And then Anne has offered an interesting response.
Okay, I'm listening, but I've got to get a power cord here.
No, George, I was thinking about it in the context of the description, and I think the description that you gave resonated very well with me, particularly as I thought about it in the context of Baldwin's comments and even Emmanuel Ako's uncomfortable conversations. One of the things when I compare centering prayer to what you described, it's exactly the same process and it's the same thing, but the one difference is that one thing you have to do out in the open. To go into that uncomfortable space and get to know a person on the other side of the coin and to exist in their world like you did when you were down in Erasmus, and to walk those streets, to live in that culture, to experience it in that uncomfortable way. That is very difficult because it's a very tangible thing. You can easily opt out of that and opt out of it because it gets very public. And to go through that in a very painful way, and to go through that potentially the wrong way, leaves you very, very vulnerable, because if you do it wrong, then you don't know what those outcomes could be. Those outcomes could be very embarrassing. It could lead to an outcome that even more plays into the fear of the flight. But with centering prayer, if I do centering prayer badly, or if I do centering prayer in a way that's not getting me past the internal conflict I'm having in my centering prayer, the only person who I've got to disappoint or have issue with is myself. And that's a much lower level of fear and a lower level of anxiety that I have to go through. And therefore that makes it a little bit easier to do. That doesn't mean that it's not the right solution. It's just that recognizing that it's almost taking what we're doing in this class and almost going to the intermediate and advanced stage by taking this and then now bringing it into now going to that next step and bringing it into the racial space. Because we've now got to really put ourselves out there, black and white, to put ourselves out there in each other's spaces to now take these principles. Because now you've got to trust that even if you do it and you don't do it well, it's going to be okay. Because in the end, you're still going to get to that solution by pushing through. And that's, I think, where I took away from what you were trying to tell us in the beginning. And I actually like that tension, because it actually, I think, is going to make me be more confident in my centering prayer to push through even harder. That's just my takeaway.
Thank you, Bill. As usual, I think that's exactly right. I see them as two different practices. So, there's contemplation and there's action, and they're linked. One is a natural outgrowth of the other. Centering prayer, in a way, is a practice that hopefully lets us be more present when we actually go out and engage the world where the stakes are increased, right? So, and maybe Resma's healing is kind of an interim step, but I agree with you. It's like, if you're just sitting in your study doing centering prayer and not getting out and actually engaging, then that's not enough. But if you're out actually engaging without having doing your centering prayer, you might not have the same presence in the engagement. I think I've told before the story that William Willimon, the Methodist bishop, tells of going down to Selma and preparing to get into a demonstration. And he's frustrated with the level of kind of preparation that the marchers are having to undergo in the church, the prayer and the practices and all this stuff. And at some point he looks up to the guy who's helping him and he says, "This is crazy, let's get out there, it's happening in the street." And the guy looks at him and says, "When you do get out there and you're facing batons and dogs and water, you need to know who you are and whose you are, or you won't survive it." And so the action was in the streets, but the ability to be present in the streets, I think, was formed in the churches. right? And that, at least to me, that's one of the lessons of that movement that seems applicable to my own life. So yeah, do the centering prayer, but then you got to get out and engage where you're challenged, where something's really at stake. And then hopefully through your centering prayer, you've learned how to be more present, and you found your identity in something that isn't going to go away just because you screwed up. So thank you. I think that's right. We are past time. I want to leave you with one quote to close. Was there more in the chat, Mary Hunter?
Yes, Anne Maxwell, that's George's sister, we're glad you're here, commented that she's interested in the internal and external tension and has a question that you can address probably later in an email or to the group. And then Barbara Pendergrass points out that centering prayer is not outcome-based. And I do think that's a helpful
Yeah,
reminder, so thank you.
good point. Good point. All right. Well, one of the things about James Baldwin in that documentary, and if you have not seen it, I really would like for you to see it, and I would like to talk about it next week. He was so incredibly vulnerable. I mean, the genius I knew about, the literary expertise I had experienced, but to watch how weary he was, how vulnerable he was, how patient he was, and it was really kind of hard for me, but powerful for me. So I really do thank Bill for recommending it to us, but also encourage you to watch it this week. But I want to leave you before we pray with a Baldwin quote. Despite all of that, Baldwin says, "I can't be a pessimist because I am alive. I'm forced to be an optimist." And so despite our willingness to engage the horror of much of what we are seeing and experiencing, and even watch it become more horrifying as we realize the depths that it actually reaches, it's good, I think, to keep Baldwin's quote in the forefront of our mind. We can't be a pessimist because we're alive. We're forced to be an optimist. I want to end where we started. I want to end with the idea that taking on the mind of Christ, as Paul encouraged us to do so many years ago, is not just about emulating his behaviors, but about finding the place in us where God emerges, which is what Christ did, found the place in himself where God emerges, and let that take him over. Let us pray. Oh God, make my hands your hands, my feet your feet, my heart your heart. Let me see with your eyes, listen with your ears, speak with your lips, love with your heart, understand with your mind, and serve with your will. I commend to you my whole being. Make me your other self. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.
Thanks be to God.